Good morning, good morning, good morning. How's everybody doing out there in virtual world? It's good to see everybody. Wow, thanks. We've got 18 people in class right now. Fabulous audience online. Quick mic check. How's my sound for everybody? How's my sound for everybody? Give me a thumbs up in the chat bar and let me know that you can hear me. Got my coffee. It's a beautiful morning. I feel good. My PowerPoints are on point. And I want to thank everybody for completing the course entry quiz. We have a great number of you that have completed it. I think we've got 192 students in my Psych 150 class, and I think about 187 of you have completed the course entry quiz. A lot of people have signed up for Remind. If you haven't signed up for Remind notices, go ahead and do that today. If you need help with doing that, send me a message in the chat bar and I'll repeat that online. Kind of quiet for me. Okay, well, most people can hear me, I think. Turn up your microphone as much as you can. Let me see. Hold on. Any better? Maybe that. Okay, well, it looks like we've only got one person. Sandra, you'll just have to pay close attention today. Okay, everybody doing well? Fantastic. Let's go ahead and switch to the PowerPoint now. Chapter 1. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to cover a definition of psychology, and then we're going to talk a little bit of the history and development of psychology as a field, and then I'm going to wind up talking about the subfields of psychology and how you can't just be a psychologist, but you actually have to pick a type of psychologist. This is actually going to be the focus of our discussion board this week and our first assignment. So you're going to want to pay close attention in the second half of the class. Let's go ahead and get started with the lecture. Okay, psychology, is defined as the scientific study of how humans think, feel, and behave. And most recently, there's been an emphasis placed on explaining how these functions are related to or controlled by the brain. Now, what we're going to say is that modern psychology was established in about 1851. You might say, holy cow, psychology is really that new? It sounds like we've been studying psychology forever. And you know what? In fact, we haven't really had scientific psychology for that long. However, the idea of thinking about how humans think, feel, and behave is as old as humankind itself. As long as we've had a campfire and time to sit around it, people have wondered what it means to think, to feel, to love, to hate, to belong. So we've always had that. It's just only recently that we've been doing it in a scientific way. And in fact, in most psychology classes that you'll see in high school, I know we have some high school students in here, things move a little quicker in college and you're expected to do things on your own. If we were in a high school class taking AP psychology, I would spend a month talking to you about Greek philosophers and other proto psychologists who wondered what it meant to be human thousands of years ago. But those folks were proto psychologists. Why are they proto psychologists? Because they didn't measure things, okay? What makes something scientific, what makes psychology scientific, is that it relies on measurement to develop theories, okay? Ancient Greeks, ancient Egyptians, ancient Romans were philosophers. They talked about what it meant to be, to think and feel, but they didn't back any of their theories up with measurement. So science equals measurement. And scientific psychology is only about 150 years old. Wow, got a great audience coming in. Thanks for everybody who's sending their chats this morning, their hellos. Warm welcome to everybody. But modern psychology is scientific, it uses measurement. Now, um, here's the deal. You may say, well, why did it take so long? Why did psychology wait so long to start measuring? You know what? There were two very big beliefs that sort of existed in the world of knowledge before 1851 that people couldn't overcome. Number one, it was thought that it was absolutely impossible to measure the mind, right? You can't see it, you can't touch it. And so people believed that this mind was above scientific measure. And then people also suggested, you know what, even if you could measure the mind, everybody's mind is different. Everybody has a different way of thinking. So, in order for psychology to be born as a science, someone had to demonstrate 2 points. Number one, that the mind could be measured, that mental abilities could be measured, and that these abilities uh, were similar for all people. I'm sorry, whenever I get to lecturing, I always get the itchy nose. What does that mean? Somebody talking about me? Right? So we're going to talk about the birth of modern psychology. We're going to talk about one man in particular, and I'm going to tell you about two other people who were very important in the development of psychology. So if we go back into the last half of the 19th century, 1850 to 1900, that's sort of the birth of psychology, if you will. Now, this fellow in Gustaf Fechner in 1851 published a book called The Elements of Psychology, and he demonstrated a very important thing. He demonstrated that the mind was systematic and that you could measure it. He demonstrated this thing called the just noticeable difference, which is the first demonstration that the mind was systematic and could be measured. He found that the smallest amount of sensory stimulus that a person could detect, change that a person could detect, was very systematic. That in order for you to detect change, a stimulus had to change a certain amount, 1/40th of its original intensity. Doesn't matter. Really, what I want you to know is that he demonstrated that the mind obeyed a systematic, uh, uh, lawful process that could be measured. And so he's typically seen as the father of scientific psychology because he demonstrated that the mind could be measured. Now, there are two other people that you're going to want to know in terms of the birth of psychology. These two fellows are Wilhelm Wundt, a German, and William James, a Bostonian who taught at Harvard. All right. Now, these two fellows are very important. Number one, Wilhelm Wundt is important. In fact, your book's going to talk about him as the father of psychology. And the reason your book's going to do that is because he opened the first official psych lab and started giving out the first credentials for psychology, the first PhDs. And so his students would become sort of uh, the the base group of scientific psychologists in the world. If you'll see over there to my right, I've got some pictures of universities um, with dates here on the United States map, and these are some of the first psychology programs in history. And a lot of these universities were going to have faculty members who studied in Wilhelm Wundt's lab. So he was the first person to open a psychology lab, and that's why your textbook likes him. Now, another person that I think is very important, and your book mentions, but your book doesn't mention this point, but the other person is a Bostonian, a Harvard philosopher named William James. And he wrote the first psychology textbook called The Principles of Psychology in 1890. And if you'll look right below me, you'll see a picture of those books. Huge, thick books. It's a two-volume series, and it was two things that are very important. Number one, it was the first official textbook in psychology. And number two, it provided a roadmap, sort of his ideas guided psychology during most of the 20th century. So, what I'm going to want you to know are these three fellows. Gustaf Fechner was the first to demonstrate that the mind could be measured. He created psychology as a scientific endeavor. Wilhelm Wundt created the first psych lab, and he was the first to award PhDs to many of the founders of early psych departments. And William James wrote the first textbook, which, as you folks all know, going to the bookstore, books are a very important part of the college process. Okay, now let's see. Um, the other thing was I do want you to know about these guys, Wilhelm Wundt and William James. They sort of created the first, if you will, approaches to studying human beings. Now, if you study human beings, the way they think, feel, and behave, I mean, that's a huge sort of topic, if you will. So what you need to do is you need to figure out a way what's important about humans. What am I going to really choose to study about them? And so Wilhelm Wundt and William James were the first people to have a sort of a general disagreement on how we should approach the study of human beings. Wilhelm Wundt was what you might call a structuralist, and he was interested in trying to understand what the mind looked like. What were pieces? How many pieces did it have, and how did these pieces work together? And so he was interested in the structure of the mind. You'd call him a structuralist. A modern example of his approach would be modern personality tests, which try to figure out how many traits we should have in a personality. What does a personality look like? How many descriptors do you need to describe someone's personality? Now, he was contrasted by William James. William James actually thought that you really couldn't measure the structure of the mind. Instead, really, you had to measure its impact on our behavior. So he was more of a functionalist rather than a structuralist. And he suggested really that it was kind of hard to look at the structure of the mind. He coined this phrase called stream of consciousness to sort of explain his point of view. He said, think about it. If you take a cup of water and dip it into a stream or a river and get that cup of water, you've measured that river. Now dump that water back in and dip that cup in a second time. Can you ever get the same exact water out of that river the second time? No. So he argued that the mind obeyed a stream of consciousness. Now, a modern example of his approach would be not only to look at personality, but how does personality affect your ability to maintain a romantic relationship? That is, what is the function of your personality? So these two guys in the late half of the 19th century sort of disagreed on how we ought to think about and study human beings. Now, a little bit more history for you. So if you go back into your textbook, you're going to see this chart, table 1.1, and it's going to talk about structuralism and functionalism. Those were two early approaches. Are people conscious or subconscious? Wow, Soulful Serenity has a great question. Are people conscious or subconscious? The crazy thing is you are both soulful, but the amount of things that you can be consciously aware of is fairly limited. However, I will show you tons of demonstrations this semester to show that a lot of our behavior, a lot of our thinking, and a lot of our feeling occurs subconsciously. That's an absolutely great question. Uh, what is a romantic relationship? Uh, Human relationships and social interaction are a part of the psychological process. Soulful, that's a great question. Um, Human beings are social animals, and so we have to talk about how those social animals interact together. You mentioned that. So actually, I am a social psychologist. I am interested in how groups and individuals interact. A couple of great questions by Soulful Serenity today. If anybody has a question and wants to interject into the chat bar, I'd love to hear you. Now, from 19 to 1950, psychology really started to get organized. Between 1851 and 1900, it was still sort of trying to figure out itself as a science. But in 1900, the study of human functioning, uh, um, the human functioning is began to really be studied systematically. And so there were what we would call, your book's going to call schools of thought. And again, these are just approaches, things that people found important about human functioning. Some people are wanted to focus on social relationships. Other people wanted to focus on how we learn things. Other people wanted to focus on how we grow and develop. So there were different, if you will, schools of thought and approaches to psychology, different ways of thinking about human functioning. Each of these early approaches was led by an important figure in psychology of historical importance. And each of these approaches were good for some reasons, and they had limitations for other reasons. And most of these thoughts are still represented in psychological theory. Okay, so if you look, you've got psychoanalytic theory, Gestalt theory, behaviorism, humanistic psychology, and cognitive psychology. These were all just, if you will, popular ways of studying and measuring the mind. And so, what I want you to be familiar with is three of the most important schools of thought or approaches to studying human psychology. Studying human psychology. There's the school of psychoanalysis, the school of behaviorism, and the cognitive school. Hi, Soulful Serenity. We're getting a little bit annoying in the chat bar. If you could please keep yourself on topic, I would appreciate that. Okay, now, psychoanalytic school of thought. Uh, how many of you believe or think that some of the bad, embarrassing things that happen to you in life, do they affect you as an adult? Are any of you carrying things around from when you were 5 or 6 that maybe make you feel bad and embarrassing? Yeah, your questions are getting a little bit off topic. I wish you would be just a little more on topic. Thank you, Soulful. Okay, so the most important thing. So Sigmund Freud was probably the first rock star psychologist. He developed one of the earliest theories of how personality works. And what he suggested is that human beings have desires in them, and sometimes these desires run into conflict in society's rules, and these things create our personality and sometimes our personality disorders. So, how many of you have ever heard the term "you're being defensive"? You're being defensive. He suggested he suggested that defense mechanisms were unhealthy strategies that people use to protect themselves from anxiety caused by feelings of shame and guilt. Have you ever forgotten about something that was really embarrassing that made you feel bad? If you did, then you were repressing that memory. So basically, that's a defense mechanism where we hide our feelings or bad memories from ourselves. So some people don't remember being assaulted as kids or don't remember being abused by their parents. In a sense, you've repressed this memory, you've forgotten it because it makes you feel bad. Now, the problem is this thing still exists in your subconscious, as was asked earlier, but that and it has an impact on your behavior. But uh, you're not actually aware of these feelings. This is what we call repression. So, how many of you have ever had somebody blame you for something that they're actually doing? Have any of you ever had a boyfriend or a girlfriend who accused you of cheating only to find out that they were cheating later? This is a defense mechanism known as projection, where we accuse others of feeling the way we feel. So, for example, you might accuse your romantic partner of cheating because you want to cheat or are cheating. Um, can you think of things that happened to you a long time ago that still make you feel sad or ashamed and affect the way you behave? If you do, then you're probably a believer in some of the things that Sigmund Freud studied. He represents the first approach. So, a lot of psychologists look at how conflicts affect who we are and how we behave. Okay, the second approach was led by a fellow named John Watson. And these folks were interested in the power of the environment to shape our behavior. How many of you have ever trained a dog, had a dog, and trained that dog to sit when asked, or to come when asked, or to go outside and use the bathroom? Right? If you've ever done that, then you've used behaviorist principles. So, behaviorists focus on how our environment shapes our behavior. Now, these behaviors believed, remember, I'm going to come back to this several times during this first lecture. The behaviorists were still not convinced that the mind could be observed or measured. So, really, what they wanted to focus on was things you could see. And what can you see? You can see how an organism's environment changes, and you can see how that affects the organism's behavior. And so this fellow, John Watson, was the first to really champion this point of view. And he actually demonstrated that you could create a phobia in a human being by altering their environment. So he took this little toddler, little Albert, and he put a white rat in little Albert's lap, and he would come up behind little Albert and make a really loud noise every time he put that white rat in little Albert's lap. And over the space of several days, little Albert became deathly afraid of the white rat. And so he showed that you could train a human being to have a phobia. Okay? He's what we would call a behaviorist. He trained a toddler, little Albert, to have a phobia of white furry rats. Do any of you have a particular song maybe that makes you happy or sad? Something that makes you think about uh, a time in your life that makes you think of an old boyfriend or girlfriend? Uh, this is what we would call classical. Uh, this is what we would call a classically conditioned response. Now, another psychologist who's sort of a behaviorist was B.F. Skinner. He was probably the second rock star psychologist after Sigmund Freud. Both of these psychologists are incredibly famous. Now, B.F. Skinner's famous for teaching rats how to press a lever to receive a food reward. If you've ever heard of the Skinner box or rats pressing bars for rewards, you are talking about Skinner's brand of behaviorism called operant conditioning. And this is learning by consequences. B.F. Skinner used pigeons and rats to demonstrate how behavior is learned uh, by the positive or negative consequences of our behavior. So, if you've ever taught your dog to sit or not to poop in the house, then you've engaged in operant conditioning, sort of the second big approach that existed in psychology from 1900 to 1950. Soulful serenity. You're really being quite immature this class. I really wish you'd find somewhere to go. So, the third big approach to psychology is called cognitive psychology. Now, you folks probably don't know this. You probably thought that computers have been around forever, but they have, in fact, not been around. Computers were invented in the late 1940s. And as soon as people created the computing machine, psychologists became interested in understanding how similar to computers human minds would be. And this led to what we would call the cognitive approach, led by a fellow right down here named George Miller. And they were asked the question, how are computers similar to or different to different to computers. How are they similar and how are they different? Cognitive psychologists study memory, attention, problem solving, language, and other information processing activities. These people ask the question, how do human beings focus and process information? Uh, the most famous of these was George Miller, like I said underneath here, and he came up with this concept called Miller's magic number, which is the average number of things that you can keep in your mind at any one given time. So if I gave you a grocery list of things that I wanted you to bring home from the grocery store, uh, you could probably only remember 7 to 10 of those items. This is what we would call your memory span, your digit span. And George Miller was the first to show that this has an average size is similar for most people. And so this is the cognitive or information processing approach. Now, more recently, if you look at psychology, a lot of psychologists have been trying to understand how you can relate these mental processes to actual brain areas, circuits in the brain. And this newer approach to psychology is called cognitive neuroscience, which is a study of how our brain's biology produces these mental experiences. Most of your long term memories are kept in the temporal lobe. So, what happens when you have temporal lobe damage? You lose your memory abilities. Most of your long term memories are kept in your temporal lobe, and which is right here above your ear. So this is the cognitive approach. Now, let's get to modern psychology quickly. The subfields of psychology. Here's the neat thing about psychology. It became very professional about World War II. Psychology really started to get organized as a science, and it wanted to become effective in helping treat wounded warriors from World War II. And so people look to psychology to provide mental health help to these wounded veterans. So psychology started to realize that it needed to have a way to systematically decide who was eligible to treat psychological disorders and who was not. And this has led to, if you will, the professionalization of, uh, of, uh, of psychology. Hold on just a second. Um, you know what, folks? We obviously have a troll on the line tomorrow. I've got some of my videos public. So what I'm going to have to do is make these private because we have an immature person on the stream that doesn't really have anything to do. I'm not sure how sad and sorry your life is that you have to come and troll a psychology classroom. I mean, that's sort of pathetic. And so instead of being mad at Soulful Serenity, let's feel sorry for that person because they clearly have some psychological issues that they need to work out. So don't really worry about these people. Okay. Do we have a limited amount of storage like a computer? You know, but three, that is a great question. Uh, um, we have a limited amount of RAM, if you will, but psychology is really not sure as to whether or not our long term memory or our hard drive space is limited or unlimited. Unlimited. Okay. Um, but you know, Soulful, you're being very, very immature this morning, so you really need to be quiet because you're saying some stupid things. Okay. Okay. So after World War II, psychology becomes very professional. So these are areas of specialization. Actually, you know what? I think I'm going to write that student number down, and we're going to have a talk with the school resource officer today. All right. All right. So these subfields, the areas of specialization, official professional designations. Now, here's the thing. When you go to graduate school, you okay. Okay. Hopefully we're back. Okay. Can everybody see me now? Okay. Very good. I am so sorry. You know what? That was sort of annoying, and I apologize for that. Okay. All right. Hold on. Let me send a quick text out to everybody. A quick text. I'm sorry, folks. We're going to take care of that problem that we've had this morning online. I do apologize for that. Okay, I'm back. It looks like most of you came back anyhow. Okay, fantastic. Are we better yet? Okay. Jeez. It's still frozen. Okay, I think it's you. Uh, it's a little blurry for me too. Okay, well, let's not worry about that. Let's go on. Here's the deal. When you go to graduate school, you do not actually go for psychology. You actually have to pick an area of specialization. So, do you folks know the difference between a cardiologist and a neurologist? Right? A cardiologist is a doctor who specializes in the heart. A neurologist is a doctor who specializes in fixing the brain. The same way that medical doctors specialize, psychologists specialize. So I am actually what's known as a social psychologist. I look at how people function in groups. Okay. And so if you look at my diploma online, you're actually going to see that I have social psychology written on my diploma. I have friends who are developmental psychologists. I have friends who are health psychologists. And each of my friends specializes in how to study human function. And so if you look in your textbook on table 1.2, you're going to see the subfields of psychology. Now, the earlier approaches right here, behaviorism, cognitism, and psychoanalysis, those weren't actually job titles. However, after 1950, we started to develop official job titles, if you will, and these are called the subfields. This chart in your textbook, table 1.2, is going to list the most common professions, if you will, of psychology. So there are elementary psychology, evolutionary psychologists, um, and biological psychologists, cognitive psychologists, developmental psychologists. These are all different areas or of specialization or groups. Now, the APA recognizes 56 different areas of psychology. You can actually look at the link that I've provided in your PowerPoint charts to find out about each of these 52 areas of specialization. If you come to the webinar tonight at 7 p.m. or at Thursday, excuse me, tonight at 8 or Thursday at 7, we're going to be talking about these subfields in depth to sort of help you with this week's assignment. So please, I encourage you to come tonight or Thursday if you can to our webinar. Now, these are the areas of specialization. What I want you to know for the exam, and what I'm going to test you on in the homework and the exam, is I'm going to give you descriptions of what people do, and I want you to be able to tell me what kind of psychology uh, there are. Yeah, it does seem like there are enough subfields for each body part. Uh, the webinars are not recorded, Mary Beth, because really they're more about you talking and interacting than passing information. Um, yes, both webinars are exactly the same. I've got 190 students, so I'm going to do 2 times to make sure that we don't have too many students in one class. If we have too many students in both classes this week, I may actually open up a third webinar time uh, because it works better when there's 20 to 30 students in one class. So if 100 of you show up tonight at 8 o'clock, I'm going to have to figure something out. Exactly. Morning are the lectures where I pass information to you, and evening is where I'm going to ask you to show me that you understand that information. That's sort of how I've got this structured, if you will, Mary Beth. Right? So here's the deal. Evolutionary psychologists look at other animals to sort of see if we can understand how humans function, how their ability has developed as their brain has evolved. Okay? Um, uh, Biological psychologists are psychologists that study neurons and chemicals and other brain structures to see if we can understand how they relate to our psychological functioning. We actually do have a subfield called cognitive psychology or cognitive neuropsychologist. In fact, I would tell you that psychology is dominated by the cognitive perspective now. There are lots and lots of different kinds of cognitive psychologists out there. Um, then there are developmental psychologists who study how babies and older people change as we grow and mature. The webinar is going to be 50 minutes. Um, then there's health psychologists. Health psychologists are interested in helping us understand how our mental functioning can affect our physical behavior. So there are behavioral psychologists. If you want to learn how to quit smoking cigarettes or you want to change your diet and eat properly, then what you do is you become a behavioral psychologist. And so I'm going to ask you questions. So I'm going to say, John helps people who suffer from schizophrenia. What type of psychologist? And what I want you to know is that clinical psychologists are interested in the factors that cause psychological disorders. So you'll say, John must be a clinical psychologist. Now, to sort of practice this, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go to a website. Go ahead and take a look at this website right here. Can you see what I'm showing you right now? This on the Science Daily. Can you see that? And you see the title of the article is "Exercise Alters Brain Chemistry to Protect Aging Synapses." Okay, can you tell me what kind of psychologist would be interested in understanding how exercise alters our brain chemistry? How does exercise alter our brain chemistry? Let's go back to the PowerPoint real quick. And which of those areas of specialization do you think would be interested in? It's a little blurry. Okay. The website was blurry. A health psychologist. Wow, a health psychologist. Yes, health psychologists typically focus on behaviors that promote health. Yes, I would agree. And so they would talk about exercise. Absolutely. Is there another area of specialization that might be interested in that? Everybody's quite right, but there are other areas as well that would be interested. I'm going to wait. What about brain chemistry? Brain chemistry. Brain chemistry. What kind of a psychologist would be interested in the chemistry of the brain? Hmm? A biological psychologist. A biological psychologist. Very good. Mesochem. Mesochem. Great. Fantastic. Here you go. What about this? When mom talks, are infants with autistic spectral disorder listening? ASD is autism. Autism. So think about this. When mom talks, are infants with ASD listening? Which kind of psychologist probably did this study? So, moms talking to their autistic children. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. What do you think that would be? Hmm? Ooh, Miso Kim, right? A developmental psychologist. And why would a developmental psychologist be interested in this topic? Fantastic, Miso. Very good. Can somebody think of another area of specialization that would be interested in this talk? Brain science and cognitive, not bad today. Hey, autism. Focus on that. What would that be? Autism. Who would be interested in autism? Personality, maybe Noreen, but I'm thinking a clinical. There you go. Mackenzie Hoyer hits the award. Clinical psychology. Clinical psychologists are interested in psychological disorders. Fantastic. We'll do one more just to see if you've got it. How about this? Uh, Brain networks enable human conversation. Julius Sleeper, good question. Educational psychologists typically focus on how human beings learn inside the school setting. So, educational psychologists typically focus on how human beings learn. They wouldn't be so much interested in a learning disorder, okay, an educational psychologist. But I can see where you would say that, Julia. That's great. How brain networks enable human conversation. Can somebody tell me uh, what area of specialization would be interested in that? Social psychologist. I could see that. That's a little bit of a reach, Indy. Dierica, biological psychology. They would definitely be interested in that. Bob, you're saying cognitive, but three, Bob is saying cognitive because you're focusing on human conversation, which is an information processing task. That's fantastic. I think you folks are doing great. So you've got the idea here. Is it fine if I keep pausing to write things down? Oh, absolutely, Hannah. Making comments are appreciated, and I really like it when you do. But you do not need to make comments. If you want to stop and watch this, in fact, if you'd prefer to come and watch the recording so that you don't feel the pressure, you can do that as well. So that's great. I like how everybody's thinking today. It looks to me like you people are understanding what I'm talking about today. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. So these are the areas of specialization. And tonight we're going to talk about them a little more in depth. And I'm going to find out tonight, which one do you think is most important? Which one do you think is most interesting? Which of these do you think would be the hardest program to pass through? So we're going to talk about these areas of specialization this week. And in your writing assignment, I have a video of a talk given by a researcher, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what areas of specialization would be interested in this researcher's talk, okay? So basically, you're going to use the same technique that we've been doing here in class, and you're going to use that for your writing assignment this that's due on Friday. Has anybody looked at the writing assignment yet? I noticed that probably 8 or 10 people have already done it. Congratulations. Way to knock things out. Now, here's the deal. You will find psychologies everywhere in our society, absolutely everywhere. And what I want you to do is just to be familiar with where you most commonly find a psychologist. Okay. Now, I want you to understand the difference between two ways of doing psychology. There are what we call basic researchers, and there are what we call applied psychologists. All right. And actually, when you go to graduate school, you are usually trained as either a basic researcher or an applied psychologist. Now, I went to UNC Chapel Hill's social psychology program, and it was a basic research program. That is, they taught me how to set up experiments, how to run experiments, how to gather data, how to do statistical analysis, and how to write scientific papers. So my program taught me how to be a scientist. And a lot of my colleagues uh, went into the area of basic research. So they're out trying to discover new things about human beings. They're basic researchers. Now, not all programs focus on basic research. If you go to clinical psychology, that is the type of people who treat psychological disorders, you are going into an applied psychological program. In applied psychology, we don't necessarily do research to learn new things. Instead, applied psychologists use what we already know to help people in the real world. So, for example, if you go to NC State, you can be an industrial psychologist. An industrial organizational psychologist is somebody who takes what we know from psychology and helps improve business practices, usually so that your employer can make more money, right? But that's what an IO researcher does. On the other hand, we mentioned educational psychologists. Now, an educational psychologist is a basic researcher. They try to understand how humans learn, and they try to suggest sort of ways in which we ought to change school in general. However, if you are struggling in fourth grade, if you've ever had a child who has an IEP, they have probably met with the school's school psychologist. A school psychologist is completely different from an educational psychologist. And what they do is they actually work at a school to help students who are doing poorly in school for one reason or another. So they are applying what we know to help kids in a school setting. So does that make sense? Do y'all understand what I'm talking about? So I could actually go to the whiteboard. So school psych helps kids in school, right? And ed psych, they um, research how we learn. Does everybody see the difference between these two areas of specialization? Does that make sense? Hopefully, do you see the difference? Okay, and so some of your researchers are going to be basic researchers, and some of your researchers are going to be applied psychologists. Now, if you look at this pie chart here, what you're going to see is that 50% of all psychologists are either in a laboratory in some school or university, okay, or they're going to be in a hospital or psychiatric clinic. So 50% of the psychologists you meet will be doing that. Now, the crazy thing is, when most people think of a psychologist, the only one they think of is the one that works in a hospital or health service. My wife is in the business world. She's a hotel manager, and she takes me to her boring work parties sometimes. And every time she introduces me to a new person and they find out I'm a psychologist, they always say to me, "Holy cow, um, you really could help me with my psychological problems." What they are doing is they are assuming that I am a clinical psychologist. Not all of us are clinical psychologists. They're talking about the 25% of the people who are in the hospital or health service. You know, or if they don't say that, they'll probably ask me, "Oh, I'll bet you're studying me right now." That's the other comment that I get from my wife's work people. And those people think that I'm working in the university as a researcher. Actually, I am, but I'm still not doing research at a cocktail party. So most people think that you're either a mad scientist doing studies or you're in a hospital or health service helping people with psychological disorders. Okay, and therapist would fall under a clinical psychology. Yes, Bob. I'm going to just jump back and answer Unique LaRoute's question. The writing assignment is homework number one. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I'll call it homework number one or writing assignment. I apologize that sometimes I'm not clear with my language and I'll skip back and forth. Thanks for calling me on that, Unique. I really appreciate that. Right, I don't want you to be confused either, right? So no problem. Bob, yeah, a therapist is a clinical psychologist. That's a great question, Bob. Now, here's the deal: not all therapists will be found in a hospital or a health service. And you probably point that out. And so those people will be in independent practice. You see, 6.3% of us are in independent practice. That's a great question. Cassette, Cassette, I'm a social psychologist, which means I know this much more about treating psychological disorders than you are. No, I am clearly not qualified. And in fact, if I wanted to be a clinical psychologist, I'd have to start all the way at the beginning. Okay. I wouldn't even get to start halfway towards the finish line. I would have to go all the way back to the beginning. In fact, since I'm going to follow up with your question, Cassette, in fact, not only do you have to have the PhD in clinical psychology, but you have to pass a state board exam. Clinical psychologists, I think, are the only ones that really have to pass board exams and have to be certified. But in order to be a therapist, you have to be certified. Now, you can be a counselor, you can be a psychiatric psychologist, but you have to go to grad school for clinical psychology, and you have to you have to be certified. You know, actually, I'm not clinical. Maybe they're special, but not that special. If I wanted to be a developmental psychologist, Cassette, I would have to start over at the beginning as well. If I wanted to be a sports psychologist, over at the beginning. Um, that's the weird thing about psychology programs. They are all completely unique. So completing one program, one PhD, does not help you at all with another PhD. You'd have to start over completely at the beginning. Yeah, it's kind of annoying, isn't it, Sandra? You know, that's even different than medical doctors. You know, if I wanted to switch from being a neurologist to uh, to a cardiologist, I wouldn't have to go all the way back to the beginning because I've taken like the first 2 years of basic anatomy and physiology and that stuff. I might be able to do that. But with psychology, you have to start all the way over at the beginning. Kind of annoying, isn't it? Right? So here's the deal. If you remember from today's lecture, I first defined psychology. And what I want you to keep in mind is that psychology is scientific. You can't just tell me I think something. I think people are this. I think people are that. We all have our pop psychological theories. But unless you can demonstrate it with evidence that you gather, you are not making a psychological statement. You are making a philosophical statement. And we're going to talk about how psychologists gather data on Thursday. Now, if you remember, I talked about from 1851 to 1900, I wanted you to understand the three main founders of psychology: Gustaf Fechner demonstrating that the mind could be measured, Wilhelm Vun setting up the first lab and giving away the first PhDs, and William James writing the first psychological textbook. I then want you to remember that there were famous people in the early 20th century who helped sort of make psychology popular. And then I tried to talk to you about modern psychology and what are the different areas of specializations or job titles that you can have as a psychologist. Okay, Ruth asks a great question. Let's see, her account name isn't her real name. Uh, Thank you, Ruth. There's no extra credit for attending these live lectures. These are here for your entertainment and for your help. If you feel like you can read the textbook and you don't need to come to a lecture, Ruth, you don't actually have to do that. And if you want to watch these recorded, that's completely fine as well. I just provide this as a voluntary service because some students want to hear the teacher lecture, that's all. But that's a great question. So, did everybody learn something today? What did you learn? Did anybody find something out that they did not know? Okay. You know, folks, I do want to apologize uh, for the troll today. In my 5 years of teaching live streaming on YouTube, this is the second troll that I've had. So it doesn't happen very often, and I don't want you folks to think it's going to be like this every class. I will follow up with this, and if this person was a student, we're going to talk about this a little bit further to make sure that this disruption doesn't happen again in class. But I just want to apologize for that. And I hope everybody had a good time today. Did you enjoy the lecture? If you did, give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat bar and let me know. I try to be jazzed up and excited in the morning. Uh, there are. It was very distracting. Yes, I know. I apologize, Sandra. I will make sure that that doesn't happen again. All right, folks, have a great day. I hope to see you in webinar tonight at 8 p.m. if you can make it. I'm lecturing Thursday morning again at 9 a.m. and I'm having a extra webinar Wednesday night in case you can't make, or Thursday night in case you can't make it tonight. Hey, have a great day, and I will see you later on. Bye.